I am Timothy Mack. I've been the president of the World Future Society for the last 10 years and a volunteer editor and conference manager for 40 years total. I think that science fiction is what future studies needs to be more like, and future studies is what science fiction needs to be more like. In other words, there isn't enough of a connection now. Future studies really needs to learn how to tell stories and help people understand the future in a more energetic and dynamic way using the kinds of images and emotional descriptions that science fiction is so good at. Science fiction needs to be much more careful about its science and even more its social science, how people really work, the psychology of humans, and the politics. All those things are things that future studies look at. And science fiction sometimes gets completely enamored with the technology. I think it's very interesting. I just talked about movies being focused on a certain a set of assumptions about the future. One of the reasons this movie is very good is because it doesn't make assumptions that the future will be all good or all bad. It shows the, as we say, the utopian and the dystopian side of life in Washington, D.C. in, I believe it's 2054. And that's very sophisticated, because in all real world situations there are going to be good things and bad things, things that work, things that don't work. And that's, of course, what makes the dance of the future so interesting. But I picked it also because it is what is called a classic. In fact, it is the most extreme futures movie, futurist movie. And the reason I say that is because so many futurists of different levels of expertise in the area were involved in its production. I mean, there's a well-known story, and it's, you know, it's a true one, that about 3 years from the production actually beginning, because they had some complications in changing of scripts and changing of who was going to be the actor and so on, so actors, was a set down for about 3 days with a group brought together by a company in San Francisco called Global Business Network. And they had, as part of their structure, an advisory group with several hundred people from a wide range of areas. And for this group of about 15, they brought together people from MIT, people in architecture, people in communication science, people in biomedicine, psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and so forth. And they talked over the course of those 3 days about what the world in 2054 would look like. And actually there's a story, which I think is true, that when they got to the end of the second day, they decided that they'd made a terrible mistake, which they didn't change in the movie, but that the world of 2054 was so radically different because the increasing rates of change from the present, which of course was 2002, that it was unrecognizable. People wouldn't relate to it. And one of the things that people say about this movie is everything seems reasonable. It seems like the kind of thing that could come out of trends we see today. And the reason is because the group got instructions to pedal back 30 years and make the movie only 20 years ahead of itself. Certainly touch screen manipulation of files, concepts, relationships is becoming very, very common now, and the technology is rocketing forward. Now, are right on target. You know, self-driving cars are already authorized in 3 states in the United States. Google is putting massive amounts of money into it, and they're moving forward quite quickly. What's happened is a lot of people saw how interesting and practical in some ways those technologies that were depicted in the movie, and they set out to create them. You know, science fiction, I think, informs the future. It sets ideal goals. It's the normative part of foresight, which is, you know, as opposed to descriptive, how are we going to get there? It is the part which says, where do we want to go? Something that hasn't come true yet because the problems haven't been solved. I just pulled this one out. There is in the movie a large flying, almost like a SWAT tank. It's a very large vehicle, and it flies around. The trouble with that is that is the classic offset of power and weight. The more power you would need to move the weight, the more weight you would need to move because power is heavy. So it's kind of an escalating conundrum. I'm not saying it won't be solved, but that's the least likely that we're going to see by the what I would call the real frame of the movie, which would be 2025. I expect to see on the side of what we expect to have is the growing rate of public surveillance. I think that was right on target. The governments and even private sector are going to pay more and more attention to what individual citizens do, for good or bad, and they're also going to pay more attention to what they buy, you know, which is for their profit, and the kinds of interactions they have related to things like disease or political issues. I just spoke to a group from China yesterday, and we talked about the fact that Chinese government is doing a face recognition program which can pick out facial features and identify people from 100 feet away. Well, I think that big data is one of those things that's kind of like zero budgeting or other what I would call faddish ideas that take on a life of their own, and people make lots and lots of money off them, especially management consultants. However, that does not mean that big data isn't real, and that things like Boolean algebra and other probability analysis techniques aren't becoming extremely refined and are able to pick out patterns from enormous, growing amounts of data, that were not previously visual or able to be visualized. So all that's good stuff. However, the biggest problem about the idea of pre-crime is that the more you look at the future and the more you understand it, the less likely is that you're going to be right. And that's because if there is, in fact, a feedback loop, people really do, and that's a variation of what I was saying about science, depictions changing science futures. People are going to change their behavior if they understand that there are increasing probabilities that there'll be detrimental results from that behavior. So I think that pre-crime in the real world is not a thing that eats free will, that in fact it's the kind of thing that becomes a great social mechanics device to manipulate populations into doing the right things because it increases the possibility they'll be caught. That's the real power of the enormous number of cameras in the UK, the ring of steel that's been put into the lower end of New York. I think there's 1,000 cameras involved in that. I think that technology will never exist that will predict the future, and I think just like any story, this scenario, the plot for the movie, was taken from a short story that had that premise, that people could predict the future. It wasn't taken from a futurist analysis, which would say how probable is it that this technology will ever exist. I don't think it's very probable at all. I have to tell you, I have a bias. My background is that I was an attorney as well as a research scientist, and the idea of people being tried in absentia before they act is politically impossible except in a dictatorship. In other words, being guilty of crimes that never occurred without your presence, without any opportunity to defend yourself, should never have been depicted in the movie, because it's, well, let's just say it created a lot of debate. It created a lot of buzz about the movie. That was wise. But as far as being something that's that should have been in there, I find it repulsive or very upsetting. Now, also, what I find that I would like to remove from the movie would be the psychic slavery of three people who have gifts that have been turned into what I would call vegetables, or put in a vegetative state in order to utilize these gifts on behalf of the government. Those poor people were also committed to incarceration without a trial. And regardless of the fact that they're helping out the government, they're certainly not being helped themselves. As I remember, at the end of the movie, they're sent off to some island and once more incarcerated, except they don't have to spend all their time in a bathtub. There's a wonderful movie called Safety Not Guaranteed, about time travel, which talks about what people would do with time travel. How would it affect their lives? How they could, would it make people happy, or would it make things much, much more complicated? Those kinds of questions. The social impact of technology is the kind of stimulation that I think we should see more of in science fiction. Not what wonderful new gadget could be invented, but how would that gadget change the people who use it, and how would it change society generally? Those kinds of questions, I think, are very, very important. I mean, I saw a recent movie called Oblivion, and it also had Tom Cruise in it. You know, that was what I would call a fantasy. It had some interesting ideas about how people respond to awful situations, you know, the decimation of a planet, and how they continue to resist what turned out to be, I hope this isn't a spoiler, what turned out to be a machine intelligence. But, you know, the technology was not incredibly advanced. It was all fairly understandable, and in fact copied from existing technology, just made to look more visually interesting. There's not as much insight into the human condition. That's what foresight should be about, and that's what movies about the future should be about. How can we learn more about the human condition? Because when we imagine a future, we don't know what it would be like to live there unless we better understand how people respond to change. Well, have a wonderful day, and thank you for this opportunity.